Lecture 1.
Hello everyone. Today I'd like to discuss what's called the three-language policy of the Indian education system. As you may or may not be aware, India is a multilingual country, and according to one estimate, there are anywhere between 700 and 1,000 languages and dialects in India. However, as you might expect, not all of these are taught in schools. But the Indian government does have a three-language policy. I'd like to talk about that today. How did the three-language policy come about? To understand this, one would have to look a little bit at the history of India, and especially this century. You might know that India was a colony of the British Empire, and it got its independence in 1947. At that time, because India was a colony of the British Empire, most of the government work was conducted in English. However, this was something that the founders of the Indian Constitution wanted to change. But they were also aware of the fact that it could not happen overnight. Or, in other words, you couldn't go overnight from conducting a government in English to conducting the duties in any Indian language. And of course, there was also the matter of which Indian language. Like I said, there were so many of them. Well, it was decided that the Indian language, which would become the official language of India, would be Hindi. And that was because 39% of the Indian population spoke Hindi. And this is the greatest number of people who spoke one language, with the second most spoken language being Bengali, which is only spoken by 8% of the population. And also, of course, it was a political decision because Hindi is also the first language of a few states which have provided most of the political leaders of India. And these were the people involved in writing the Constitution. So there was that political aspect that influenced it as well. However, as I mentioned earlier, they wanted to keep English as one as well. So it was decided that after independence, in a period of 14 years, Hindi would become the official language, but English would continue to be an associate official language of the Indian Union. This period, it was thought, would be sufficient for there to be a transition from English over to Hindi, and that's how things progressed. But when this 14-year period was about to come to an end, there was a lot of unrest in the country. In fact, people came out into the streets, and there was a lot of rioting. You might wonder why that happened. Like I said earlier, only 39% of the Indian population speaks Hindi as the first language. The rest of the population has many different languages as their first and mother language. And most of these people who have other languages as their L1 or first language are in the southern states of India. And people in these states were kind of scared at this point because they felt that they might be discriminated against in all aspects of life, especially in government jobs. If knowing Hindi would be compulsive because they would not be able to compete with Hindi speakers. So they came out onto the streets, they rioted, and they asked for a continuance of English as the associate official language of the country. Eventually, the government had to give in to their demands, and it was decreed that until further notice, English would continue to be an associate official language, and that's how it stands today. Although it has been almost another 40 years since that decision. Now, that was a little about the background of English and Hindi, and now that leads to the three-language policy of the Indian education system. Now, as you can understand, Hindi by itself could not serve the purpose of a language that could be used for communication within the country, or for running the government, or for other aspects of the country, because a lot of the population wouldn't know it. Therefore, as a result of this, the government came up with a three-language program, which states that when students graduate from school, they should know 3 languages. One of these is expected to be Hindi, the other is expected to be English, and the third language is expected to be the regional language, or the mother tongue of the area or the region in which they go to school. This policy, you might think, is quite clear-cut, and that everyone coming out of school would have these 3 languages, and there would be no problems with communication, or even in the levels of proficiency in English and Hindi, especially since these are official and associate official languages of the country. However, that is not the case. That is because the government has not laid down how many years in school children are supposed to use which language, nor has the government laid down which language is supposed to be the medium of instruction. And schools are therefore free to decide which language is to be used for the medium of instruction. This could be any of the 3 languages. The second language, which is supposed to be taught from grades 4 to 10 at least, could be any of the 3 languages. And the third language, which is supposed to be taught for a period of 3 to 4 years, could again be any of the 3 languages. So a child could come out of school, which takes a policy of teaching through English, and do his or her entire education in English, and another child could come out of another school which uses a local language as the medium of instruction, and where English is only taught for 3 or 4 years. Then these children could compete to get into the same type of universities. And that is a disadvantage for the children who have not studied English extensively, because in India, most of the higher education is conducted in English. So, although the government tried to be as inclusive as possible and not to impose which language should be the medium of instruction or which should be taught for whichever period of time in school, I feel that they went to the other extreme. And in doing so, they kind of disadvantaged some students. In fact, a great number of students who do not learn English for the same number of years, which some other students do, but have to compete for some similar types of areas, for example, in higher education and jobs, where they're obviously disadvantaged against students who might have studied Hindi or English for a greater number of years. So this is one problem that is continuing to face the Indian education system. But there are no easy answers to it. And that, of course, would take another lecture. Thank you.
Please answer the questions found on the internet browser for this lecture. You will have 5 minutes to complete the questions before the next lecture starts. Submit your answers, but do not go beyond the next page until the following lecture is finished. Lecture 2.
When it comes to diseases, we often develop immunity or protection against them in one of two main ways, both of which are equally effective. One of these ways is a passive way, where our body develops a natural immunity to a disease because we have been exposed to it. When we go to the doctor, we often end up getting the second type of immunity, active immunity, by getting vaccinations, which are injections of liquid that has inactive or non-disease causing viruses in it. These vaccinations are quite important in battling diseases that were previously life-threatening or caused major problems for people. For instance, if we graph the frequency of polio and measles, we can see that the introduction of vaccines almost eliminated both of these diseases. Both types of immunity are quite effective. The main difference comes with the ability to make our own immunity. But what do we really know about this? Today we're going to talk about the history of the vaccination movement and some of the challenges that have come with it. Vaccinations actually have quite a long history, dating all the way back to the 18th century. At this time, Edward Jenner, an English doctor, started to notice that exposure to cowpox, a disease that caused sores on cows, seemed to prevent individuals from getting smallpox. So Jenner decided that he would develop vaccines from cowpox, a much less serious and deadly disease than smallpox, that could be injected into people in an attempt to create immunity. With his vaccination came sharp declines in smallpox, which has been almost eliminated today, and his efforts essentially brought about the birth of the vaccine movement. After Jenner, we see an explosion of work toward creating different vaccines. In the 19th century, we see Pasteur growing rabies in the spinal cords of rabbits, which were later dried out, so the inactive virus, or a virus which could no longer cause rabies to show itself, could be put into injections. This proved to provide tremendous amounts of help in preventing rabies, a virus which previously would certainly attack the brain and kill the person who got it, by providing a means of preventing the disease from spreading if an individual was bitten by an animal that had it, thus saving countless lives. Advances in vaccine development continued into the 1930s, when viruses began to be grown by scientists in cells in the laboratory. Therefore, they were able to grow viruses in dishes rather than injecting them into living things first. Therefore, viruses could be put into vaccines without having to harvest them from living animals, which required that the animals be killed. This process, originally developed by Hugh and Mary Maitland, helped to reduce the numbers of severe reactions that were seen with some of the previous vaccines that were made by growing viruses in animal tissue, which had left some people with serious health problems and had led some people to opt not to get vaccinated. It was in the 20th century that we see perhaps the quickest advancement in vaccination methods. Following Hugh and Mary Maitland's technique of growing viruses in cells in a laboratory, research in vaccination found a number of new and convenient ways to grow viruses, which made it possible to grow more viruses and more easily supply vaccines to everyone who needed them. For instance, Ernest Goodpasture found that he could use chloroallantoic membrane in an egg to grow 30 different kinds of viruses, the most common of which is measles. In fact, we still use this method for measles vaccines today. Cell cultures, or growing cells in controlled conditions, have also made it possible to adapt viruses that were previously difficult to grow for vaccines such as polio and grow them in larger quantities. In the case of polio, where the vaccines are effective 95% of the time, this was a major accomplishment. In addition, it helped to drop the cases of paralysis, or cases where individuals were unable to move parts of their body, that was caused by the polio vaccine, previously made using animal spinal cords. Finally, in recent years, we have seen researchers start to use the fetal cells in blood in order to make new vaccines. Fetal cells, or the cells of unborn babies, have been used to create new vaccines for rabies as well as for hepatitis A and rubella, two diseases that previously we could not find a way to create vaccines for prior to this new technique. Finally, the hepatitis B vaccine was developed using human blood and is the only vaccine to be developed in this way. Researchers were able to take blood from people infected with hepatitis B and purify it in such a way as to make it nothing other than hepatitis B surface proteins remained, making it impossible for people to get infected with the virus, but allowing for the immune system to recognize and prevent future infections by live viruses. This method of hepatitis B production was later discontinued when it was found that it was possible to make this vaccine using recombinant DNA procedures, which is when they take the gene from a virus and combine it with the DNA of yeast, which they use in baking bread. The gene in yeast produces the same proteins as the virus without the ability to actually infect anybody with the virus. Therefore, the proteins are taken and added to the vaccine so the immune system can learn to recognize the proteins and instantly start to fight off a hepatitis B infection should the virus actually make it into the person's system. As was discussed earlier, vaccines have proven to be very effective in lowering the number of infections caused by certain diseases. You would think that these vaccines would be welcomed by everybody then, right? Well, unfortunately, this isn't the case. While there have always been those who object to vaccination on religious or personal grounds, we have seen a shocking rise in the number of other people who support the anti-vaccination movement recently. These anti-vaccination opinions have arisen due to a study conducted by Dr. Andrew Wakefield in 2003 that found a supposed link between vaccines and autism, a behavioral disorder. The study was picked up by celebrities such as Jenny McCarthy and has therefore caused a large increase in the anti-vaccine movement and a rise in suspicion toward what people call big pharma, or the major pharmaceutical companies that produce the different vaccinations for the public. However, these claims have been found to have no basis because Dr. Wakefield's data was found to be fabricated and the interpretation of the data was biased. A series of studies conducted since then have all found the opposite, that there is no link between vaccines and autism. Even though this has been the case, suspicion still continues, and the anti-vaccine movement continues to gain members, leading some parents to choose not to vaccinate their children. This not only endangers those children by making them susceptible to dangerous illnesses, but also others that are exposed to these children, even those who have been vaccinated. Why is this, you might ask? How can I or others be in danger if I've been vaccinated? Well, there are two major reasons for this. First, some people cannot be vaccinated because they have allergic reactions to certain vaccines. So they rely on others being vaccinated to help prevent their illnesses. And second, vaccines are never 100% effective. So even if you do get vaccinated, there's a slight chance that you may still catch the disease. So we often rely on everybody getting vaccinated in order to keep this chance down as much as possible. If groups of people don't get vaccinated and then catch the disease, then it is more likely that you will catch it, even if you have been vaccinated. We need only to look at recent events to see proof for this. Whooping cough and measles, two diseases that were near to being wiped out, have recently come back in epidemic proportions due to lack of vaccination. How this will play out in the future is a mystery. Recent court cases have stated that parents are required to vaccinate their children, but these are still being fought further. We will discuss this more in our next class, though.
Please answer the questions found on the internet browser for this lecture. You will have 5 minutes to complete the questions before the next lecture starts. Submit your answers, but do not go beyond the next page until the following lecture is finished. Lecture 3.
Today we're going to talk about the Dada art movement. If you think Dada sounds like a word that has been made up, then you're correct. The term Dada is a nonsense word. It has no meaning at all. We don't know what the origins of the term are, but we can trace the art movement back to its start. Prior to World War I in Europe, there was a sense of rationality, of order. And at this time, everything was viewed as stable and following rules. And much of this can be seen in the painting of the time. However, once World War I came and went, many Europeans found their world had been changed. Millions of men died in the war and cities were destroyed. Europeans had never seen destruction like this before, and now they questioned the culture of rationality and order that they had previously been so willing to accept prior to the outbreak of war. Because of this, the time following the war became known as the Age of Disillusionment, or a time when people were disappointed that the world was not how they actually thought it was. So, how does all of this relate to the Dada art movement? Well, because of the war and the way it flipped culture on its side, many artists began to push art's boundaries. They started to create paintings that were meant to display the sense of absurdity that had appeared. The artwork was absurd in that it was meant to shock the public by presenting the ridiculous and absurd concepts that the Dada artists sought to paint. So you can see that Dada artists rejected reason or rational thought. Because of the war, they no longer believed that rational thought would help to solve social problems and that a new type of thinking was required. Let's take two artists as examples, Marcel Duchamp and Salvador Dali. Duchamp was very much the pioneer of the Dada movement. He was originally a painter and after the war stopped painting and turned to making sculptures that he referred to as ready-made. They most likely got that name because they were made from readily available materials. For instance, one such sculpture was made of a stool attached to a bicycle wheel at the top. At this time, many people reacted to such works of Dadaism negatively. They found the art of the movement to be distasteful and outrageous. Many of them didn't think that the works were art at all. That's how far they were from their previous conceived culture and rationality. You would think this would discourage Duchamp and other Dadaists, but actually this is what they wanted. With the rise of Dada art, they were actually seeking to produce non-art or anti-art. They actually sought to disregard all rules previously made under the culture of rationality. In addition to these sculptures, Duchamp would also try to take established cultural standards and try to challenge them through other works. One way he did this was to take works of the great painters of the past and edit them. One such work that some of you might be familiar with is one called LHOOQ. In this painting, he actually took a reproduction or a print of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa and drew a mustache and beard on her face. In doing so, he was disrespecting a treasured painting of the past that has even to this day been held in high regard, receiving praise from many people. Such disrespect was an important characteristic which characterized much of Duchamp's work and the early Dada movement. But what about other artists? How did they represent this movement? As the Dada movement started to gain momentum and popularity, you could see influences from the outside of the art world show themselves. One strong influence was Sigmund Freud, a psychiatrist from Austria who published a series of essays on the subconscious and the interpretation of dreams prior to the start of World War I. At first thought, you might think, well, what does psychiatry have to do with the art movement? But you have to remember that the Dada movement rested in the absurd, and as it advanced, its members began to focus on the more surreal and subconscious characteristics of human nature as a means for freeing human imagination and creativity. The free association technique associated with Freud allowed artists to draw whatever came into their mind, allowing for a direct connection with their subconscious. They believed that this would help to free people from the rationalism and logicality that had trapped them and led to the war. In a way, they believed that this was more effective for promoting social change than directly attacking the social conventions of the day, as Duchamp had been doing. This brings us to another great artist of the period, Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali is actually probably the best example of this new Dadaism. Starting out in the Cubist tradition under Pablo Picasso, Dali soon became interested in Freud's ideas, which ultimately led to a change in his artistic style and ended up fully embracing surrealism in his work. Now, as I said, the new Dadaism stopped attacking cultural norms and started focusing on freeing people through free association techniques, which is basically when you write or draw whatever comes to mind without stopping it from happening. Dali's paintings show this in that the subject matter is almost dreamlike in appearance. For instance, one of his most famous paintings, called The Persistence of Memory, presents the viewer with a picture that is full of melting clocks, representing that time is not a rigid concept. It is actually dependent on the person experiencing it. Looking closer at the painting, one can also see ants on a pocket watch, which Dali often used to symbolize decay in his work. In this instance, they were used to show the decay of typical conventions or ideas of what time is. The painting further shows the colors blue, yellow, and brown, colors Dali often used to represent his home country, Spain. The way that this painting was made is meant to help the viewer to step inside the dreams of an artist and, by doing so, to open up the viewer's imagination and, in this way, rethink the cultural norms of the day. While Dali did not directly challenge culture and social norms through his painting as Duchamp did, he did paint with the purpose of encouraging individual imagination by freeing it from the chains of conservative Victorian ideals. As you might recall, I mentioned that Dali started in the Cubist tradition, which was characterized as being rational, ordered, and logical. It is interesting to note here that even though he started out in the Cubist tradition, Dali began to attack the work of Cubists, such as Pablo Picasso, who he initially respected and wanted to work with in his early years. Nobody really knows for certain why he suddenly started doing this, but many have speculated some of the reasons, with many looking at the different ideologies of the two movements. So basically, we have this movement in art that sought to find ways to deal with the fallout from World War I by both challenging the cultural norms that preceded the war and that many thought were a direct cause for the conflict, as well as by promoting more freedom of thought as a way of moving away from conservative thought toward more open-minded views. While this art movement essentially ended at the start of the Second World War, its influences still continue today and provide a starting point for the abstract expressionist movement that followed, with many of the best modern artists showing Dada characteristics in their artwork. Few movements in art history can claim to have such a far-reaching effect on art as we know it. But this is something we will go into in more detail in our next lecture.
Please answer the questions found on the internet browser for this lecture. You will have 5 minutes to complete the questions before the next lecture starts. Submit your answers, but do not go beyond the next page until the following lecture is finished. Lecture 4.
Okay, the topic of today's lecture is there anybody out there? And of course, by that phrase, is there anybody out there, I am referring to extraterrestrial life, to aliens, as many of you are sure to know. There was a conference in 1948, at which time an Italian physicist, Enrico Fermi, when discussing the possibilities of extraterrestrial life, suddenly blurted out, "Well, where are they?" Meaning, where are the aliens? Where are the extraterrestrials? Now, by extraterrestrial, I mean extra, beyond, and terrestrial, Earth. So beings beyond Earth. And Fermi's question of where are the aliens has come to be known as Fermi's paradox. In other words, if there is extraterrestrial life in the universe, why haven't we found it yet? Aliens should have in fact visited us by now if they are in fact out there. Now, some people will think that the pyramids in Egypt were built by aliens, but most real scientists don't think we've been visited yet. So, the question we need to ask to think through Fermi's paradox of where are the aliens is approximately how many extraterrestrials, civilizations might there be, which would be people who might be able to visit us. How many aliens might there be in the galaxy? And there's actually a man by the name of Dr. Francis Drake, who in 1961 came up with something called the Drake equation. He attempted to give a way of thinking about how many extraterrestrial civilizations there might be. So, to give you an abridged version, a simplified version of the equation. Now, an equation is just a mathematical sentence stating that two expressions are equal. So, for example, 5 equals 2 plus 3 is an equation. Or, Einstein's famous E equals mc squared is an equation. Now, the Drake equation is trying to answer the question of how many extraterrestrial civilizations are there in our galaxy. And you may want to write this down as I give it to you, because it will be on our exam. N equals n sub p times f sub life times f sub civ times f sub now. N stands for the number of civilizations in the Milky Way, our galaxy, equals n sub p. Sub p simply means a subscript p on the right side of the letter. F sub life, a lowercase f, is equal to the number of planets with life. Now, to have life, the planets must be in what's known as the habitable zone, an area of the solar system near the sun or a star where the conditions for supporting life exist. Often in astronomy, we refer to this as the Goldilocks zone, in reference to the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where, as many of you will know, she kept trying all of the things that belong to the bears, from their porridge to their beds, until she found the item that was just right or best for her. In the solar system, we need the distance from the star to be just right in order for life to form on a planet. So we often look for planets in this Goldilocks zone as potential places for life to develop. For example, Venus, Earth, and Mars are thought to be in the Goldilocks zone of our solar system. Only the Earth has developed life so far. Now, f sub civ, the lowercase f signifying fraction, is the fraction of planets with civilizations. So civ stands for civilizations. So first you have to have planets, then you have to have planets with life. Then you have to have planets which develop civilizations. The final term, f sub now, now means the fraction of planets with civilizations that exist now. Because If someone is going to try to visit us, their civilization has to be active now. If it perished many, many years ago, or if it hasn't developed a civilization yet, then it's probably not going to come visit us. So again, the Drake equation is basically the number of civilizations in the Milky Way equals the number of planets, n sub p, times the fraction of planets with life, f sub life, times the fraction of planets with civilizations, f sub civ, times the fraction of civilizations that exist now, f sub now. Okay, and this is known as the Drake equation. Now, Drake himself estimated that there are about 10,000, what he would call, communicative civilizations in the Milky Way. So, 10,000 possible civilizations that are able to contact us. Which brings us back to Farabi's paradox, which we mentioned at the beginning. Well, where are the aliens? If there are 10,000 potential civilizations to contact us, where are they? There are three possible answers to Fermi's paradox. The first is just that the civilizations are not common. Maybe we're the first. The galaxy is about 10 billion years old, and Earth is about 5 billion years old, and yet the human civilization has only been around for a little while. In fact, we only really entered the space age 50 years ago. So maybe civilizations just aren't very common. Or maybe because civilizations aren't so common, lots of star systems remain unexplored. So maybe there are alien civilizations out there, but they just haven't gotten around to exploring our neighborhood yet. So that's just the first possible answer. The second possible answer is that these civilizations, these extraterrestrial civilizations, don't leave their home worlds. And there might be two reasons for this. One, maybe they're just uninterested in interstellar travel. We've only been to the moon, and as a matter of fact, some people are even saying that maybe we shouldn't even send a man on space explorations anywhere. Maybe we should just have robots and things. So maybe people just are uninterested in space travel. Or the second reason, a bit darker possibly, is that maybe civilizations destroy themselves before they achieve interstellar travel. And again, just looking at ourselves, we have the capacity for space travel, but we also have the capacity for massive world destruction with nuclear weapons and things. So maybe civilizations that could have visited us already have already destroyed themselves. The third possible answer, which in my mind is the most interesting, is that civilizations exist, but maybe they're leaving us alone on purpose. That is, there is someone out there are aliens out there, and they have decided that we're just not interesting enough to visit. Maybe we are not evolved enough to be interesting. For example, would you travel to Alaska to look at some bacteria? To try to communicate with bacteria? Well, probably not. It's probably not very interesting. There's more interesting places to go. For that reason, maybe there are civilizations that exist, but maybe they're just waiting until we develop further. That was a bit about Fermi's paradox and the Drake equation.
Please answer the questions found on the internet browser for this lecture. You will have 5 minutes to complete the questions before the next lecture starts. Submit your answers, but do not go beyond the next page until the following lecture is finished. Lecture 5.
Today, we're going to discuss what it means for a person to be good or just from two different philosophical backgrounds, classical philosophy and deontology. If we're going to discuss goodness and justice, what makes an individual good or a society just or virtuous, then we need to start with the ancient Greeks. So we'll start with Plato's philosophy. Now, some of you may have studied Plato's philosophy in some other course, so this might be easy. Okay, at the risk of boring you, let me give you an overview of Plato's ethical theory. Plato says that the soul has, and by soul, he simply means that which animates the body, gives it life. Anyway, he says the soul has three separate parts, called faculties, which I'll come back to. He believed that goodness in an individual was found when these three parts of the soul work together, when they weren't in conflict, but existed in harmony. A good or just person will have a soul where the three faculties work well together. So how does he arrive at that analysis? Well, he starts out in his very famous work, The Republic, by saying that it's very difficult to get a grasp on what the individual soul looks like. So, to get some idea of what the individual human soul is like, he says we should study the structure of society. What kinds of people and activities every society has to have. He argues that every society has to have three groups of people: workers, soldiers, and leaders. And each has sort of a defining characteristic. Every society has to have workers, like farmers or people who work in factories, producing all the things that we need for everyday life. And according to Plato, the key feature of workers is that they're focused on their own desires or appetites, interested in satisfying the needs of the body. So workers are associated with desire. Now, if you live in a society that has a good amount of wealth, good agriculture, good industry, other societies are probably going to try to take it. So you need a class of soldiers who are supposed to protect the state from external threats. These soldiers are going to be in dangerous situations quite frequently, so you need people with a lot of spirit, an emotional type of individual. Emotion is what characterizes that group. And then Plato says that the third group you need is leaders. Their main role will be to think rationally, to use their reason or intellect to make decisions. As decision makers, leaders determine what the state is to do, how the affairs of the citizens are to be run. Plato then asks himself, okay, assume we've got such a society with these three groups. When will this society be a good and just society? Well, you can only have a good society when its three parts are working well together, each doing its proper thing. And Plato believes this can only happen if workers and soldiers learn moderation or self-control. But why? Why do workers and soldiers have to learn self-control? Well, how can a society flourish if the workers and soldiers don't control their desires and emotions? Plato thinks that if they aren't under control, workers will sleep too much and play too much. So they're not going to get their jobs done. And soldiers need to channel their high-spiritedness in a certain direction, precisely by being courageous. But you're not going to get that automatically. You need to teach them this kind of moderation. So you need an educational system that will first of all train leaders so that they'll make good decisions, so that they'll know what's wise. Then make leaders responsible. Turn over to them the education of the two other groups. And through education, build a society so that workers and soldiers learn to use their intellect to control their desires and emotions. If you had all that, for Plato, you'd have a good or just society. Now, take that picture, that social political picture, and apply it to the individual person. You remember that soul, that it consists of three separate parts or faculties? Can you guess what they are? Desires, emotions, and intellect, the characteristics associated with the three main groups of society. And can you guess how Plato defines a good or just person? Well, it's parallel to how he characterizes a good or just society. The three parts have to be in harmony in each of us. Our desires and emotions often get the better of us and lead us to do foolish things. They're in conflict with the intellect. So, to get them all to work together, to coexist in harmony, every person needs to be shaped in some way, in the same way that we've shaped society. Through the educational system, individuals must be educated to use their intellect to control their emotions and desires. That's harmony in the soul, and therefore results in a moral, good, or just person. What about other philosophical traditions, though? How do they define goodness? If we fast forward to the mid-18th century, we can see a clear difference in the way philosophers thought of goodness. At this time, we had Immanuel Kant and the philosophy of deontology. In deontology, the philosophy no longer examines the soul, but rather the actual acts that a person performs. Kant stated that a person is good based on two things. First, they act in a certain way out of duty, and second, the act that they perform is good on its own. What does this all mean? Let's start by examining his first point. Kant believes that a person is good if he acts out of duty. What does this mean? What is meant by duty exactly? Well, in Kant's terms, acting out of duty refers to acting out of respect for a moral law. This moral law has several characteristics. First, it's universal. Everyone has the option of acting in this way, even though not everybody will act in this way. It upholds human dignity. In this sense, the moral law ensures that people are not being used by others as a means for an end. Or, to put it more simply, the person taking an action is not simply using other people as a way to get what he wants so he can later throw them away like trash. Finally, the third characteristic, reciprocity. For this, an action should be seen as fair from all different perspectives. Therefore, if a person is following the moral law, their actions should have these three characteristics in them. If this is the case, they are acting out of duty. But acting out of duty is only half of the picture that contributes to a good person. Kant's second requirement for ensuring that a person is good is their acts to be good on their own. Something is considered good on its own when we can add it to a situation and it will not make it ethically worse. Now, you might have some idea of what might be good on its own. When asked to think of good things, many people will think of intelligence or persistence or even pleasure. However, Kant believed that such things are actually not good in themselves. For instance, while intelligence can be good and lead to positive acts, such as positive scientific discoveries, it can also produce negative results. We've all seen movies where an intelligent man or woman played a villain, and we've seen intelligence produce things such as nuclear weapons. Therefore, Kant stated that the only thing in the world that is truly good is goodwill. Or to put it in other words, the good intentions behind an act regardless of the consequences, since we can't control the consequences of our actions. Therefore, while Plato believed that goodness is based on the harmony of different parts of the soul, Kant believes that goodness is essentially based on the intentions behind individuals' actions and their relations to duty. Both of these philosophical traditions emphasize the importance of intellect and morality, where one must act out of rationality and in a way that upholds the moral law and look out for the good of others. They differ in one important characteristic. While Plato believes that goodness is a guarantee of happiness, Kant does not. Rather, he believed that goodness was necessary for deserving happiness. But we will talk about this more in our next class.
Please answer the questions found on the internet browser for this lecture. You will have 5 minutes to complete the questions before the next lecture starts. Submit your answers, but do not go beyond the next page until the following lecture is finished. Lecture 6.
Let's talk about the concept of choice and how it is deeply rooted in the culture that we grow up in. A while ago, I was doing research in Japan. While I knew that there would be cultural differences and misunderstandings, they constantly popped up in places where I least expected them. For instance, once, when at a restaurant, I wished to order a cup of green tea with sugar. The waiter politely refused, telling me that one does not put sugar in their tea. Upon further requesting the same thing, the manager was involved, this time telling me the restaurant had no sugar. Not being able to order my sweet tea, I decided to order coffee instead, which came with a packet of sugar. This incident was not due to misunderstanding, but to differences in our concepts of choice. Americans tend to have the perspective that a paying customer, upon making a reasonable request, should have that request met. One need only look at the mottos of Burger King, "Have it your way," or Starbucks, "Happiness is in your choices," to see this. The Japanese perspective was different, though. They wanted to protect me from my ignorance when I asked for something inappropriate according to their cultural standards. My point is that Americans seem to think that all humans have an innate and universal desire for choice. However, I would like to show you, by discussing 3 different assumptions, how this is not the case and doesn't even hold true within our own borders. Assumption number 1 states that if a choice affects you, then you should be the one to make it. In the US, the individual is the primary locus of choice. You have to be true to yourself, no matter what other people suggest. But do we benefit from this approach to choice? I did a study examining this question. 7 to 9-year-old Americans of European descent and Asian Americans were put into 2 groups. Group 1 was shown 6 piles of puzzles and were given the choice of which puzzle to do and which marker to use. Group 2 were told which puzzle they would do and which marker they would use. Anglo-Americans did 2.5 times better than Asian Americans when they were given the choice of which puzzle and which markers. In contrast, Asian American children performed best when someone chose for them. Immigrant children had a higher sense of community, and they preferred to let those they trusted and respected make the choice for them. Thus, our first assumption only holds for those whose culture encourages a self that is clearly separated or divided from others. Those who come from a culture that values collective choices may find individual choice might have a negative effect on performance. Assumption 2 says, the more choices you have, the more likely you are to make the best one. Stores like Walmart have 100,000 different products, and Amazon.com has 27 million different books. You'll surely choose the best product or book when all of the possibilities available. However, if we test this assumption, we see that this isn't necessarily the case. In one study, a person interviewed in Eastern Europe who were residents in formerly communist countries. The people were offered a set of 7 different drinks, including Coke, Diet Coke, Sprite, so on. During the first session, participants made comments saying that the drink choice did not matter. It was all just soda to them. Asking them how many choices there were among the drinks, they all said there was just 1. When juice and water were added to the 7 soda choices, they said that they had 3 choices: juice, water, and soda. Of course, this is not the case in the United States, where we often have a die-hard devotion to a particular flavor or brand of soda. Modern Americans are exposed to more choices and more ads with options than anyone else in the world. Choice is not only about what the product is for us, but also about who we are. Add this to the assumption that more choices are better, and you have a group of people who believe that every little difference matters. So every little choice matters. However, Eastern Europeans were suddenly flooded with choices. When asked what words or images they thought about when thinking about choice, one individual said he associated choice with fear, since he was used to having no choice. there was too much there in the new market, and many were finding them artificial. You can see that in reality, many choices between things are not that different, and that the value of choice depends on our abilities to perceive these differences. Though all humans share a basic desire for choice, we do not see it in the same way. When one has not been trained to see these differences, the presence of so many choices can be frustrating and confusing. Instead of guaranteeing that we make the best choice, we become overwhelmed by choice and sometimes even fear it. This can even happen with Americans, who have been found to make poorer choices and decisions when given 10 or more options. This leads to the third and final assumption. You must never say no to choice. This is another problematic assumption. To examine this, let's compare people in the US and people in France. In the US, let's say we have a couple, Susan and Daniel, who are about to have their first baby. One night, when Susan is 7 months pregnant, she has to have an emergency C-section. The baby suffered a loss of oxygen and was unable to breathe on her own. The doctors gave the couple a choice. They could remove the baby from life support, which could cause her to die in a matter of hours, or they could keep her on life support and she could live without being able to walk or talk. In a study of American and French parents, all parents had suffered this tragedy, and in all cases, life support was removed and the baby died. There was a big difference in both places, though. In France, the doctors decided if the baby was taken off life support. But in America, the choice rested with the parents. It was found that this decision had an effect on parents' abilities to cope with their loss. Americans expressed more negative feelings than French parents did. French parents were likely to say things like, "Noah was here for so little time, but he taught us so much." American parents, on the other hand, were likely to ask, "What if?" Some parents even felt that they played a role in an execution. But when American parents were asked if they would rather the doctor made the choice, they all said no, even though the choice made them feel guilty, angry, and depressed. The parents could simply not think about giving up their choice because it would go against everything they had learned. The story of the American dream is a story of limitless choice. Freedom, happiness, success, they are all based on choice, and therefore a large number of choices are necessary. However, when we take a closer look, as we have seen, the story starts to show holes. And you see that it can be told in different ways based on the culture we belong to. No single narrative serves the needs of everyone, everywhere, and it can be seen that Americans could benefit from taking new perspectives and putting them into their own narrative. Robert Frost once said, "It is poetry that is lost in translation," suggesting that what is beautiful and moving cannot be communicated in different languages. However, Joseph Brodsky said, "It is poetry that is gained in translation," suggesting that translation can be a creative and transformative act. When it comes to choice, we gain a lot from engaging and translating other narratives so that we can open ourselves to a wider understanding of what choices can do. Doing so will help us to more fully see choice in all its complexity and beauty.
Please answer the questions found on the internet browser for this lecture. You will have 5 minutes to complete the questions before the next lecture starts. Submit your answers, but do not go beyond the next page until the following lecture is finished.